Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Wendy Williams, and this is the third lecture covering Chapter 2. This is Chapter 2C, Recording and Observing Recording Behavior. Today we're going to talk about observers, specifically who the people are who will be observing the participant or client or subject, and who will be gathering data on that individual while they're watching. And observers can be almost anyone. The nice thing about behavior analysis is that the techniques that are used for observation can actually be taught to teachers and parents and psychiatric and medical personnel, and individuals can pretty much learn to do this. It's even been taught to relatively young elementary school age children. And so while the person may be a professional behavior analyst or a graduate student or an undergraduate student undergoing training, it can also be a caregiver or a significant other. Individuals can even observe their own behavior if they're trained. Typically, we're talking about normally functioning individuals, typically developing individuals, but that includes both children and adults. But the important point here is that all observers have to be trained to take accurate observations. There's no shortcut to training, and so that's an important piece. Training and practice are two of the most important pieces of data collection when it comes to working with individual clients. There are a lot of forms of technology that can assist us in gathering data. Once you're observing, how you go about recording the data, documenting whether or not a behavior has occurred, how long it's lasted, whatever aspect or dimension of behavior that you're measuring, you need some kind of technology in order to record it. The simplest technology, of course, is pen and pencil. Having a clipboard with a data collection sheet and marking down check marks, pluses and minuses. If you have a clock going, you can put down the time that the behavior begins, the time that the behavior ends. But there are also a lot of clever techniques that have been developed over the years to assist with data collection other than just paper data sheets. Here on the left, today we have iPhone and iPad apps that we can use to gather data, which is really nice. You can simply just go on and turn on or click a behavior when it occurs. At the top, you see ranger beads. The use of ranger beads goes back all the way back to the 1950s. There's usually 2 sets of beads on the lanyard. There are usually 10 beads, so you can count up to the number 10. And when you reach 10, you go to here, I'll use my cursor. So here are 10 ranger beads, and you slide them one at a time when the behavior occurs. You slide them from one end of the lanyard to the other in this little section where it gets stuck on this knot, and then the next behavior you slide a bead, and then the next behavior you slide a bead, and you go all the way till you get to 10. And when you reach 10 and all the beads are now moved from the left side of the lanyard to the right side of the lanyard, you now move one of the beads in the smaller section. That's a 10 bead. So you move that one over, and now you begin moving them back. And when you reach 10, you move another one. And so you can gather, and this one has, I think, up to 50 plus 10 would be 60. So you could gather 60 data points with this set of lanyard beads, ranger beads. Hand counters like golf counters or these can be helpful in just counting. They're very useful when behaviors happen quickly. So this ranger bead system works pretty well when behaviors only happen occasionally, but if you're counting behaviors that happen rapidly, you might want to use a hand counter. Back in the 1970s and the early 1980s, barcode technology became very popular, where you could just wave a wand over a barcode for each behavior. I haven't seen those used very much anymore, but I think lots of folks have them out there, and they're perfectly useful. Having a simple stopwatch can help you with timing of behaviors. And this here, the aprons and paper clips, are one of my favorite data collection techniques for teachers. Then they're really interesting. This apron has 3 pockets, and so you put all of your paper clips into, say, the left red pocket at the beginning of your observation period, and you strap it around your waist. And so, for example, if a teacher is trying to keep track of how often she's reinforcing good behaviors versus punishing or criticizing bad behaviors, she could collect data on herself. Every time she provides a reinforcer, she can take a paper clip out and put it in the green pocket, and every time she uses a criticism or a punishment, she can take a paper clip and put it into the yellow pocket. And at the end of that time period, the end of that hour or the end of that session, she can go back and look and record how many times she engaged in those two behaviors and what the ratio is. Ideally, we like to have much more reinforcement relative to the rate of punishment. And so often when teachers begin this, they find that their punishment pocket is very full and the reinforcement pocket is not as full. And you want to reverse that ratio. So your book talks a lot about these different kinds of technologies, and so you want to make sure you read this section in your book really thoroughly. Now, as part of training for observation, one of the things that's very important is that all of your observers are consistent in their observations throughout your study and throughout your intervention. You want to make sure that everyone who is observing, everyone who's gathering data, is using the same definitions. So how you define your behaviors, how clearly they're defined, how explicitly they're defined, knowing the difference between what is included and what's excluded is really important. Not only that you do it, but also that all of your observers are consistent in the application of those definitions. What we really want to avoid is observer disagreement, where we have two people observing the same set of behaviors and coming up with different data sets. That would be bad. And something that we call observer drift, where at the beginning of a treatment, we're applying the definitions, our operational definitions, one way, but as we get deeper and deeper into the intervention, our definitions in our heads shift a little bit. And so we call that observer drift. And we want to avoid both of those. We want to be consistent from the beginning of the study or the intervention all the way to the end. And we want to make sure that everyone who's gathering data is using those definitions in exactly the same way. There are two forms of inter-observer agreement, IOA. Typically, you need a minimum of two sets of data for the same observation. So whether you have two people standing and watching and recording, or whether you have two people recording off of the same videotape, you can get two kinds of agreement. The first is called inter-observer agreement, which means that you have two separate observers, and they both gather data on the same set of behaviors, and then they compare their recording to each other to see whether or not they agree. And then there's intra-observer agreement, which is making sure that you are consistent within yourself. And so that would be, typically we use videotape to do intra-observer agreement. I will say record 20 minutes of data on a set of, say, primates at the Seattle Zoo, and I might be doing some sort of intervention to reduce fighting or aggression. And so I have my definitions, I've got everything, and I'll record an hour's worth of data. And then I will go in and look at that recording and score the data. I will go in with my data recording instruments and I will write down all of the data that I see. So I'll go in and collect the data. And then maybe a week later, I will, while I'm doing other observations, I will go back and check myself. And I will go back and record data on that same session again and test myself against myself after a delay. And so we really want to have strong agreement both between observers and within the same observer at different time periods. That way we can talk about our findings with confidence, and the readers and the consumers of the work that we're publishing, or the people that are consumers of that information, like our bosses or the supervisor at the group home that you might be working at, they have confidence that you're being very consistent. So that's really useful. So once you have data collected, the question then becomes how you calculate IOA, and that really depends on how you gathered the data, what kind of system that you used. So, inter-observer agreements are typically represented by percentages, the degree to which you and I gather data on the same set of behaviors and the percentage of agreement that we have with each other. And so we want them to be very high. High IOA percentages mean that we agree most of the time. Low IOAs mean that sometimes you see the behavior and I don't, or I see a behavior and you don't, and we don't agree on how many behaviors happened, how long they lasted. We have some disagreement. So we're trying to raise our IOA percentages to increase the confidence in our data. And the way we can do that is if we have low percentages, if we only agree, 50 or 60 or 70% of the time, first thing we can do is we can discuss and identify sources of disagreement. We can go back and talk about how we're using our definitions, why we're including things and why we're excluding things. We can use those discussions to refine our definitions so that we come to more agreement on what we're counting and what we're not. And then to continue practicing as a way of increasing agreement before we actually collect real data. Practice is really important before you collect data. And so that's a really a key is to make time in your intervention plan for your observers to watch and practice their observations. Now, according to Keith Miller, in his textbook from 2005, the amount of percent agreement that is acceptable depends on several factors. When the definitions that you're using are relatively new definitions and have not been used very often in the literature, when behavior happens very, very rapidly, when the settings are very complex, when you have lots of factors making data collection difficult, 80% agreement is considered acceptable. However, when the definitions are well established and have been used for a long time in the literature, when behavior happens only occasionally, not in rapid succession, and in settings that are more simple and easy for data collection purposes, we really aim to be at around 90% or higher. And aiming for 100% is very appropriate for very simple behaviors in simple contexts that only occur occasionally and are separated by periods of non-occurrence. So the expectation for your IOA percentages increases as the behaviors become simpler, as the contexts become less complex, and as the frequency of the behavior declines. So how do you go about calculating inter-observer agreement? Yeah, I wanted to check here. Yes, that's right. Okay. When it comes to calculating IOA, typically, again, we've mentioned that you have two or more observers watching the same behavioral events using the same data collection sheet or data collection technologies to record their observations. We then take the data from each of those observers and plot them together for every observer across the observation period. And what we are looking at are the agreements, the periods when the observers agree. So under those circumstances where we say, did the behavior occur in this particular interval or at this particular time, the answer is either yes or no. We then look to see whether or not the different observers agree on whether or not the behavior occurred. We then take the number of observation periods and they're labeled as either periods in which they agree or periods in which they disagree. And then finally, we calculate the number of agree intervals divided by the total number of intervals to get the percent agreement. So let me give you an example. So, and I'm going to use my cursor to point a few things out as we go. All right, so we have two observers here. Here are observers in this column. We have Emma and we have Enrique, and they're both watching the exact same events as they unfold. And an X means it occurred, leaving the interval blank means it did not occur, and they both gather data across 15 intervals. Emma, here you can see she has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 intervals in which she saw the behavior occur, 5 in which it did not. Enrique has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 intervals where he saw it occur. And you'll note that they do not always agree. But what we can do is for each interval, so here's interval 1, they both saw that the behavior occurred, so we record it as an agreement. The same is true for interval 2 and interval 3. But for interval 4, Enrique recorded a behavior and Emma did not, so we call that a disagreement. We have another disagreement when Emma sees the behavior in interval 5 and Enrique does not. But in interval 6, both of them agree that the behavior did not occur. And so we have agreements and agreements. Here they agree that the behavior did occur. Again, here they agree that it did not occur. It's when one sees the behavior and the other does not, as in intervals 10 and 11, that we end up with disagreements. Now I can count how many agreements and disagreements we have. We have 15 intervals, but we have 10 intervals where they agreed, and the remaining 5 they did not. So you divide 10 by the total of 15 observations, and you get 67%, and that's considered not good enough. They need to go back and practice more. They need to talk about why they disagree. Is it something that Emma is ignoring, or is it something that Enrique is counting, or vice versa? And so here we have a series of intervals. We have data from 2 observers watching the same behaviors during those 15 intervals, and they only agree 67% of the time. That's not good enough. They do need to go back. Now, there are other kinds of IOA that are more specific. For example, we can calculate IOA for occurrences and for non-occurrences separately, especially when we're trying to determine whether the behavior happens when someone thinks a behavior has occurred or when non-occurrences happen. So we can lump all the occurrences together and look at only intervals where we have the behavior recorded by someone as occurring, or we can look only at those intervals where at least one of the observers believes that it did not occur. And we can look to see whether we're having more difficulty with occurrences or whether it's the non-occurring intervals that are causing problems. And that can help us narrow down where our problems are and what we need to discuss and what we need to fix. So it really helps you identify whether your biggest problem lies in seeing the behavior or those intervals where someone's missing the behavior. So again, here's that same set of data. And the question is, do Emma and Enrique have good IOA for occurrences only? And so what we do, notice that some of the agreement and disagreement boxes are now empty. And that happens when both of them agree that it did not occur, because that would be a non-occurrence. So we leave those boxes blank. And we only score the ones where they agree, or the disagreement where they agree that it did occur, or where the disagreements are that someone saw it and another person didn't. So now there are only 12 intervals where someone saw a behavior and they only agree 7 times when somebody sees a behavior. So that's an even bigger problem. 7 out of 12 is 58%. So they clearly have an issue with identifying when behaviors occur. That's definitely an issue for these 2 observers. Now we can also go back and look at non-occurrences. So now you'll notice most of our data is now no longer scored because there are 10 agreements where there are a number of places where they agree that the behavior did occur, and we don't care about those. What we do care about is where they either agree that it did not, or at least one person thought that it did not occur. And there are a total of 8 of those intervals when at least one person did not see the behavior occur, and possibly the other person did. In fact, out of the 8, only 3 times do they agree. And when you divide 3 by 8, you see that their non-occurrences are only 37%. So Emma and Enrique agree more when the behavior occurs. They have lower agreement ratings when they believe that someone believes that the behavior did not occur, but overall they really do need to address both their definitions of occurrences and of non-occurrences in order to pull that overall IOA value up. So the important thing that we need to recognize is that this inter-observer agreement is critical to establishing the antecedents and consequences of the behavior, because we have to agree on when the behavior occurs in order to look at what comes right before and what comes after. So once you have good solid definitions and you have evidence of high inter-observer agreement, now you can begin to move forward in your intervention. You can begin to conduct a functional behavioral assessment where you'll be able to start looking at what comes immediately before the behavior and what comes after the behavior. And we'll talk more about that in Unit 2 in Chapter 13. You'll be able to identify those antecedents and consequences for the behaviors. You'll also get a better understanding of what the function of the behavior is. What's its purpose? What does the individual get out of that behavior? What starts the behavior going and what happens? What are the consequences of that actions will really tell you what purpose the behavior is serving. And as we do this, we can begin to develop an intervention that's based on this data-based analysis of behavior, based on the actual evidence of what is preceding and following the behavior, and what the function of the behavior is. So having really strong inter-observer agreement is key in ultimately determining what the ABCs of behavior are, which help to lead to an effective treatment. All right, that's it for Chapter 2. We'll see you back for Chapter 3. Have a good afternoon.